My name is Gary Schnell, and I'd like to welcome you into my home near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I have been doing a series of YouTube videos in an effort to highlight different elements of my recently published book, Consciousness, All in One and One in All. Today I will be picking up on Chapter 11, whereby I've been talking about the translation of information between the consciousness of the protophenomenal one, consciousness and information, and the all, which I include all living things. You may recall the last time that I was talking about a diagram in an effort to highlight this. This is the diagram to which I refer, and we have protophenomenal consciousness and information, and we have the brain, the left and the right, which could just as easily include the entire body, since all of the things I'm talking about include all the cells of the body, and the translation of that information into the personal information space via the quantum dynamics of DNA with its stability and its unpredictable nature, made up of multiple amino acids. It is able to store vast amounts of information. And all of this involves self-organizing living systems that are self-organizing because of their quantum coherence. And that quantum coherence is existent in DNA. And it's that may perhaps allow DNA to communicate with the protophenomenal consciousness and information. But it's also worth speculating, and this is a big speculation, I grant, but no one else has any better answers by any stretch of the imagination. It is the nature of DNA and its potential for two-way communication that might allow it to be the element that is able to abstract meaningful, life-giving, and consciousness-giving information from the protophenomenal consciousness and information with its vast amounts of energy that I have speculated might be God. We have no other credible theory regarding how life and consciousness came to be. So we have these self-organizing systems, we have quantum coherence, and Pim Van Lommel, the cardiologist that I have referred to repeatedly, advanced three possibilities for how this quantum coherence and information exchange might take place. The first he referred to as virtual photons. Now, virtual photons, but what that essentially means is that every chemical reaction in the body involves electrons and the release or absorption of photons. And that includes muscles, nerves, epidermis. It includes every cellular reaction. It includes DNA. It includes RNA. And so we have a constantly changing electromagnetic field. Each of these reactions has its own unique resonance, its own unique waveform that may be communicated into the protophenomenal one. Since I'm dealing with DNA, each and every change in DNA might change the electromagnetic waveforms and allow for a different level of information or degree of information exchange. So we have all of these waveforms in our brain, for example. And let's just say that for a near-death experience, our brain is going out of commission, and fewer reactions are taking place, and fewer photons are being absorbed or emitted, to the point where perhaps we have one waveform, one photon. But then it's important to remember that waveform, that photon, is entangled with all of the other waveforms of the brain that have turned off. And that waveform may carry a vast amount of information in holographic form. it's worth considering whether that is a way of understanding a near-death experience. And for that matter, out-of-body experiences. Perhaps there is, with the stimulation of that area in the temporal lobe just over the hippocampus, perhaps there is something to be said for the waveforms in that area causing information exchange with the personal information space, and the person has a sense of floating above his or her body, seeing things around them despite the fact that they have no eyes to see, or hearing things around them despite the fact they have no ears to hear. Speculation, I know, but worth looking into. This brings us to the second idea that Van Lommel talks about, and that is the idea of the quantum Zeno effect. Now, there is a sense that there has been data suggesting that when you look at a quantum reaction for any period of time, it freezes. Well, that's called the Zeno effect, after the fellow who had the philosophical idea of watching an arrow travel through space and having its distance traveled consecutively to the point where essentially the arrow can be thought of from a philosophical standpoint of standing still. Well, that's essentially what the quantum Zeno effect deals with. It is the brainchild of a fellow named Henry Stapp, who is a physicist. He was looking for a psychophysical bridge between the information that we are processing, the physical, and experience that we end up having, which becomes a part of the personal information space. His thesis involves consciousness only influencing cortical neural processes, internal neural processes, not external reality. So that as we attend to an idea, as we pay attention to it, essentially what might happen is that with our focus and our concentration on this idea, be rewiring the pathways or the neural patterns of our brain such that neurons, this is Hebb's rule, neurons that fire together, wire together, so that as these neurons fire, given our focus and concentration, they change their wiring and neural patterns change. And this is one of the things that is thought to occur when we pursue mindfulness or meditation, such that we are changing the stress or the anxiety or the fear that is so much of the amygdala's connections with the frontal cortex. And we are changing that by focusing on things like our breath and rewiring things to run through the insula from the hippocampus and affording us more relaxation and perhaps an ability to understand more about what has been so fearful or frightening from the past. This is also the principle for neuroplasticity, whereby as we focus on something, we change the wiring. And that brings us to our third potential for communication between our brains and personal information space, and that would be something called quantum spin correlation. And again, it involves the fact that every cellular reaction, every reaction that's occurring involves, in this case, changing of the dynamics of quantum spin. Now, every proton and neutron in the nucleus, every electron, photon has a spin, and it's inherently a part of these particles. Now, again, we have all of these reactions going on. When we change spin, photons are emitted or absorbed. And when a magnetic field to these photons, the emission or absorption of these photons, they become visible. And this is what we observe when we use an MRI machine. These electrons of hydrogen, the electrons of hydrogen are emitting or absorbing photons, and the magnetic field of the MRI is making them visible. And then we can see the results of an MRI. It's these three kinds of ideas that may play a part or explain the transmission of information between the body, the brain, and the personal information space. Again, we're dealing with quantum coherence and self-organizing systems. Now, each of these three potential explanations are not mutually exclusive. So we could have certain amounts of the quantum Zeno effect, certain amounts of the virtual photon, certain amounts of the quantum spin effect. And it may be all of them or parts of all of them to varying degrees that are playing a part in the communication of the DNA between the physical and personal information space that is connected with protophenomenal consciousness and information. Now, I want to talk a little bit about DNA. DNA is stable and it is information rich, allowing for quantum resonance. It's quantum mechanical in nature. We're free to speculated being the mediator that allows for consciousness and life as we know it. Information that's passed may involve quantum Zeno, quantum spin, or virtual photons. And it's important to understand that DNA is a very long, thin structure. And there are 46 of these threads. There's 2 pairs, so essentially 2 pairs of these threads are 23 in the cell, in each and every one of our cells. Now, this DNA is wound about within these cells. It's way too long to fit inside a cell, so it has to wind up. Now, this winding is not variable. It is determined, if you will, by the DNA being wound about some proteins called histones, so that the DNA is bent in different areas. It's also important to remember that the genes that are on the DNA, these lengths of amino acids that get read, that they're very seldom one long thread that gets read. Because of the winding of the DNA, parts of the strand are closer to, let's say, for example, you have this kind of a thing. The parts of the strand here and the parts of the strand here are closer to each other than the parts of the strand out there, so that the gene may involve this kind of reading, skipping all of the stuff outside. Now, we know that we have a lot of material in our DNA that doesn't work to transcribe information. We have a lot of material that modifies the transcription of information. Unlike lower species, if we call them lower, where some of them have more DNA than us, don't have the kind of modification ability with their DNA that we have. And this is all a part of histones and what gets attached to histones. It's all a way of modifying, how our genes are read. For example, if an acetyl group is added to a histone, it is more likely to open up the transcription of that gene. If a methyl group, a chemical group known as a methyl group, is added to that histone, it is more likely to close down the transcription of that gene. So what we have, in essence, is a way of changing the function of the DNA without changing the structure of the DNA. And it's important to realize then that if we're changing the function of the DNA, we're also changing the interactions of the DNA. We're changing the field around the DNA, maybe by quantum spin, maybe by quantum Zeno effect, maybe by photons, virtual photons, but we're changing the field, we're changing the dynamic so that any change may translate into alternative information into the personal information space. The other thing that's important to be aware of is that we come from one cell, one tiny little cell with homogeneous DNA. All of the cells in our body have the same DNA. But what ends up happening as our cells start to divide is that different parts of the cells are turned on or turned off, such that we get the different tissues of our body when all is said and done. So the cardiac cells that we have, they have the same DNA as the neural cells that we have, but that DNA is read differently. The information off of that DNA is read differently than the information off of off of our neural cells. And there is a variance to the electromagnetic fields around the heart, around the brain, and around each and every cell. And it's important to be clear that's what's happening. Now, this is what we call epigenetics. It is epigenetics that influences these cells to go their different directions. The environment in which these cells are dividing, some of them the cells have an exposure to the outside of the environment, and some of them only have an exposure to the other cells within these dividing group of cells. So the environment is different for all of these cells as they begin to divide. And this allows for the histones, for example, the histones to have different attachments to things like acetyl groups or things like methyl groups that allow for readings of different elements of the DNA or not reading of different elements of the DNA, and we get the information that we have. But it's also a way of understanding that we take in information from our environment all the time. It's not like a Lamarckian thing where we're going to grow longer necks like giraffes to reach the taller parts of trees. But it is like we take in this information and it changes things that we are going to attend to. It changes our focus, and that changes the functioning, the attachments of our DNA, the resonance that the DNA has, and its ability to communicate. So we have this thing called epigenetics that is consistent with our DNA and consistent with how we develop different organs, different subgroups that have their own self-organizing capacity. So we have our own DNA. It's characteristic to all of us. It resonates according to the different things that we're dealing with. We have a personal information space, and our DNA is more similar to other humans' DNA and how it resonates. Whereas, as I've expressed in the past, a dog's DNA is resonates differently. So we all have our own personal information space, we all have our own collective unconscious, and we all add to the information of the collective conscious, the protophenomenal consciousness and information. It's important to see that the DNA, that we're not the only ones that are communicating with the protophenomenal consciousness and vice versa. Any DNA system, any DNA life form can have this same kind of resonance that might be translating information. And this is the kind of thing that might help us to understand things like the queen of certain insect hives might have the effect that she has. You separate a queen, not all insect groups have queens, but you separate a queen, and not all insect groups that have a queen have this kind of thing happen. But if you separate a queen from certain groups, certain hives, it does nothing to the group. The group continues to function as it always has. It's very organized. So you separate the queen a very great distance. The group still functions great. But then you kill the queen. It's kind of like separating at a very great distance, but once you kill the queen, the group becomes chaotic. It is no longer organized, and it no longer functions as it once did. Now, is this because of resonant DNA that's having an effect? Who knows? But there are other examples, like when we see starlings in flight, or other flocks of birds, or when we see different schools of fish move. It's almost as if they're communicating with one another what they're going to do, because it looks so harmonious and beautiful in its own way. When we consider, and these experiments have been done, where a caterpillar is trained to appreciate something that's noxious, and then it goes through its metamorphosis, and the moth, that the effect of that metamorphosis, that moth appreciates the same noxious stimulus, despite the fact that the functioning of the caterpillar is greatly different from the functioning of the moth, and there have been such extensive changes. How do we explain it? Well, maybe it's this resonance of DNA in this information space, or there's a single cell little creature called Stentor razilii, And I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It is spelled Raesilii. And this is something that was cited by Rupert Sheldrake in his many books. It's his morphic resonance theory. And this little creature is a single cell. And it responds to noxious stimuli by contracting and pulling away. And it responds to stimuli that allow for it to feed by expanding and staying where it's at. Now, there are many noxious environments to which it must respond. It doesn't have a nervous system like you and I because it's a single cell. So what's going on? Is there some way this little single cell creature has of storing information? Is its DNA resonant with its own personal information space such that it can keep this information available to it at a moment's notice? Now, we're going to be looking at things like this in ourselves when we talk about memories, when we talk about the function of our immune system, when we look at things like transplant memories. We're going to be talking about these things in greater depth. This ends my exploration of Chapter 11 and the potential for communication between living things, DNA or RNA based. RNA can function the same way as DNA with its own resonance. And the protophenomenal consciousness and one of the 0-point field, non-local space, the dark energy, inflationary energy of our universe that I think could otherwise be considered God, though, of course, all quite speculative, but I think all worth wondering about because we have no answers as to how life and consciousness came to be. And this may provide some understanding. Now, they have, and I've talked about this previously, they have models using chaos theory of how prolonged lengths of things can come together, amino acids, proteins, can come together, and it's not inconceivable that DNA would have eventually come together and then acted as I'm talking about it acting now, as a resonance communication between physical of space-time and non-physical, non-local space of the protophenomenal consciousness and information. I wish to thank you for your ability to stay with me. I hope this has been understandable. It's complex, it's speculative, but I would welcome any questions that you have, either on my YouTube site or on my webpage, and I'll do my best to get back to them. Thank you very much for your time, and be well.